Title: The Slum. Descent into Darkness. Chapter 1. The Rumours. The first time Daniel heard about the slum was at a small, rundown coffee shop on the outskirts of the city. It was a place frequented by wanderers, the kinds of people who knew about the forgotten corners of the urban sprawl, abandoned subway tunnels, derelict factories, and places whispered about but rarely seen. He was sitting at the corner table, scrolling through photos from his last exploration, when he caught a snippet of conversation. The slum. People go in, but they don't come out. Daniel's ears perked up. He glanced over at the group, a couple of men in their mid-30s, their eyes hollow as if they had seen too much. The name slum lodged itself in his mind, a splinter of curiosity that grew with each passing second. He leaned closer, straining to hear the details. Last one to go in was some kid, one of the men said, his voice barely a whisper. Think they found his bag by the entrance but no sign of him. Same as always, the other replied. It takes them. No one comes back. Daniel couldn't let it go. The thought of a place that took people, swallowed them whole, was irresistible. He'd heard rumors of haunted buildings before, urban legends meant to scare off trespassers, but this felt different. There was a weight in the way they spoke, a seriousness that hinted at something far more real. He knew he had to find out more. The following days were a blur of research. The slum wasn't on any map, and the internet had almost nothing, just a few scattered forum posts, half of which had been deleted. The people who talked about it spoke vaguely, as if afraid to say too much. The building was hidden, they said, behind other abandoned structures in the oldest part of the city. It was a place where time had stopped, where shadows moved even when there was no light. Daniel's friends tried to dissuade him. They knew his obsession with urban exploration, the way he pushed boundaries for the sake of his channel. But this time, they were adamant. Don't do it, Daniel, his friend Marcus said, his voice laced with genuine concern. This isn't like the old asylum or that abandoned school. People have died. They vanish, and no one knows why. That's exactly why I need to go, Daniel replied, a manic glint in his eyes. There's something there. Something people are hiding. If I can capture it, think of what that could do for the channel. Think of the views. Deep down, it wasn't just about the channel. There was a pull, a fascination that he couldn't explain. It was almost as if the building was calling to him, whispering his name through the walls of the city. At night, he dreamed of dark corridors and shifting shadows, of doors that led to nowhere. He woke up drenched in sweat, the name slum echoing in his mind like a chant. A week after he first heard about it, Daniel found himself standing in front of the building. The slum was even more imposing in person. An ancient structure, its windows dark and hollow, like the empty eye sockets of a skull. The walls were covered in grime, graffiti scrawled in languages Daniel didn't recognize. Vines crept up the sides, their leaves blackened as if the very life had been sucked out of them. The entrance was a heavy, rusted door, barely hanging on its hinges. Daniel felt a chill run down his spine as he approached, a cold breeze emanating from within, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and rot. He hesitated for a moment, a part of him screaming to turn back, to leave this place and never return. But the pull was too strong. He had to know what lay inside. He pushed the door open, the metal groaning in protest, the sound echoing through the empty street. The darkness inside was thick, almost tangible, and as he stepped over the threshold, it felt like the building swallowed him whole. The door slammed shut behind him with a force that rattled the walls, and the temperature plummeted. Daniel shivered, his breath visible in the cold, stale air. The interior was a maze of crumbling walls and sagging floors. The walls were covered in strange symbols, some carved deep into the plaster, others painted in a dark, almost dried blood color. He ran his fingers over one of the symbols, feeling the rough grooves beneath his skin. It was like nothing he'd ever seen before. Alien, ancient, filled with a meaning he couldn't quite grasp. As Daniel moved deeper into the building, the whispers began. Soft at first, like the rustle of leaves in the wind, but growing louder with each step. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, surrounding him, filling the air. He turned, trying to locate the source, but there was nothing, just empty rooms, their corners swallowed by shadows. He pulled out his camera, determined to document everything. The lens focused on the darkened corridors, the symbols, the decaying furniture that lay scattered across the floor. But something was wrong. The screen flickered, the image warping, as if the building itself resisted being captured. Frustrated, Daniel shook the camera, but it was no use. The whispers grew louder, almost as if mocking his attempt. He continued on, moving through rooms that all looked the same, each one more decayed than the last. The floor beneath his feet seemed to shift, the wood groaning, as if alive. In one room, he found a pile of belongings, backpacks, jackets, a few notebooks. Daniel's heart skipped a beat as he realized what they were. The people who had come before him, the ones who never returned, they had left these behind. He knelt, picking up one of the notebooks, the pages yellowed and brittle. The handwriting was shaky, desperate. The words spoke of the building changing, of doors that appeared and disappeared, of hallways that stretched on forever. The final entry was barely legible, the ink smudged as if the writer's hand had been trembling. It spoke of figures in the dark, of whispers that grew louder, of a feeling of being watched. Daniel's breath quickened, his hands trembling as he closed the notebook. The air around him felt heavier, the whispers now a constant presence, echoing through his mind. He stood, his eyes darting around the room, and for the first time, he felt true fear. This wasn't just an abandoned building. There was something here, something alive, something aware. Suddenly a sound echoed through the hallway, a door creaking open, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Daniel froze, his heart pounding. He wasn't alone. Slowly he turned, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The footsteps grew louder, coming closer, each one measured, deliberate. "Hello?" he called out, his voice barely a whisper. There was no response, just the sound of the footsteps, now almost upon him. He backed away, his flashlight flickering, the beam growing weaker, the darkness pressing in. The whispers grew louder, overlapping, their voices urgent, filled with something that sounded almost like hunger. The door behind him slammed shut, the sound reverberating through the building, and Daniel knew, with a chilling certainty, that he was trapped. The slum had taken him, just as it had taken all the others. The whispers rose to a deafening roar, the darkness closing in, and Daniel felt the world shift around him, the floor falling away, the walls bending, twisting. He stumbled, his vision blurring, his thoughts disintegrating under the weight of the voices. Somewhere, deep within the building, a door breathed, its heavy, labored breaths echoing through the slum. The whispers spoke of it, urging Daniel towards it, promising answers, promising an end. He had come here seeking truth, and now, it seemed, the slum was ready to show him exactly what that meant. He moved, his body no longer his own, his feet dragging across the rotting floorboards. The whispers guided him, their voices filling his mind, drowning out his thoughts, his fear, his desperation. The building seemed to pulse around him, the walls narrowing, the ceiling lowering, the darkness pressing in until it felt like he was walking through a living, breathing organism. Daniel knew deep down that he was no longer in control. The slum had him, and it wasn't going to let go. He had wanted to find the truth, and now, as he approached the breathing door, the cold, organic texture of it beneath his fingers, he realized that the truth was far more terrifying than anything he could have imagined. He opened the door and stepped through. Chapter 2. The Invitation. The darkness swallowed Daniel whole as he stepped through the door. The sensation was immediate, an intense cold that clawed at his skin, the whispers now deafening, echoing from every direction. His flashlight flickered once, twice, and then died completely, leaving him in utter darkness. He blinked, trying to adjust, but there was nothing to see, only blackness so complete that it felt as though his eyes had been sewn shut. He took a step forward, his feet shuffling across the gritty, uneven floor, and suddenly the air changed. It felt thicker, as if he were moving through water rather than air, and with each step, the whispers seemed to grow louder, more distinct. They were no longer just background noise. They were voices, each one whispering his name, urging him forward. "Daniel! Daniel!" The voices coiled around him, curling inside his ears like smoke. They were intimate, taunting, and he could feel their cold breath against his neck. He shivered, his heart pounding in his chest, his skin prickling with fear. Suddenly, the ground shifted beneath him, as if the building itself had moved. He stumbled, throwing his hands out to catch himself, but his palms met nothing but empty air. Panic surged through him as he fell, his body plummeting into an unseen abyss. He hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the breath from his lungs. For a moment, he lay there, gasping, the cold pressing against him from all sides. Slowly, painfully, he pulled himself to his feet, his entire body trembling. The whispers had quieted, but they hadn't disappeared. They were still there, lingering just beyond the edge of his perception, a reminder that he was never truly alone. He looked around, his eyes searching the darkness, and then he saw it. A faint light, distant, barely more than a flicker. Hope sparked within him, and he moved towards it, each step a struggle, the cold air biting at his exposed skin. The light grew brighter, and he realized it was coming from a doorway, a narrow opening that seemed to pulse, its edges shifting and blurring. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the frame, and stepped through. The room beyond was unlike anything he had ever seen. The walls were covered in pulsating symbols, their light casting strange, flickering shadows across the floor. The air was thick with a metallic tang, the scent of blood and decay. In the center of the room was a table, and on it lay an object, a small black box, its surface smooth and cold. Daniel approached the table, his breath catching in his throat. The whispers were louder now, their voices overlapping, becoming one, a deep guttural sound that seemed to come from the very walls. He reached out, his fingers trembling, and touched the box. The moment his skin made contact, the room shifted, the walls seeming to close in, the symbols flaring to life, their light blinding. A sound echoed through the room, a low, rhythmic thumping, like the beating of a heart. The walls pulsed in time with the sound, the light from the symbols flickering, casting the room in a disorienting strobe. Daniel's vision blurred, the world spinning around him, and he felt the ground shift beneath his feet, as if the building itself was alive, breathing, moving. Suddenly the whispers stopped, the silence so complete that it was almost deafening. Daniel stood there, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps, his heart pounding in his chest. The box in his hand seemed to pulse, its surface growing warm beneath his fingers, and then, without warning, it opened. The light that poured out was blinding, a searing white that filled the room, and Daniel felt himself being pulled forward, the force of it almost overwhelming. He stumbled, his body moving of its own accord, drawn towards the light. He tried to resist, but it was no use. The pull was too strong, and as he moved closer, the whispers began again, louder, more insistent, their voices filled with urgency. They spoke of answers, of truths that lay hidden, of secrets buried deep within the darkness. "Come to us, Daniel," they whispered. "See what lies beyond. See the truth." The light grew brighter, the pull stronger, and then suddenly he was falling again. The world around him dissolved into a blur of light and shadow, and he felt himself being dragged down, deeper into the darkness, the whispers growing louder, their voices echoing through his mind, filling every corner of his consciousness. He hit the ground hard, the impact sending a shock of pain through his body. He lay there, gasping for breath, the cold pressing against him, the darkness thick and oppressive. Slowly he opened his eyes and found himself in a new room. This one was smaller, the walls closer, the ceiling lower. The symbols were still there, glowing faintly, their light casting eerie shadows that seemed to move on their own. In the corner of the room was a door, its edges glowing faintly, a soft pulsing light that seemed to call to him. The whispers urged him forward, their voices filled with anticipation, with hunger. Daniel stood, his body aching, his head pounding, and moved towards the door. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the cold surface, and pushed it open. Beyond the door was a hallway, long and narrow, its walls covered in the same glowing symbols. The air was colder here, the darkness thicker, the whispers louder. He moved forward, his footsteps echoing off the walls, the whispers growing louder with each step. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, the walls narrowing, the ceiling lowering, until he was almost crawling, the darkness pressing in from all sides. Suddenly, the hallway opened into a vast chamber, its walls covered in the same pulsating symbols, their light casting strange flickering shadows across the floor. In the center of the chamber was a figure, tall and thin, its face obscured by a dark hood, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. The whispers grew louder, their voices overlapping, becoming one, a deep, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate through the very core of his being. The figure turned towards him, its glowing eyes locking onto his, and Daniel felt a wave of fear wash over him, his body trembling, his heart pounding in his chest. The whispers urged him forward, their voices filled with a sense of urgency, of inevitability. He took a step forward, his body moving of its own accord, drawn towards the figure, the whispers growing louder, more insistent. "Come to us, Daniel," the figure whispered, its voice echoing through the chamber. "See the truth. See what lies beyond." Daniel took another step, his entire body trembling, the fear almost overwhelming, but the pull was too strong. He moved closer, his eyes locked on the figure, its glowing eyes staring into his soul. And then, suddenly, it reached out, its hand closing around his wrist, its grip cold and unyielding. The whispers rose to a deafening roar, the light from the symbols flaring to life, blinding, and Daniel felt himself being pulled forward, the darkness closing in, the world dissolving around him. He tried to scream, but no sound came, his voice swallowed by the roar of the whispers, the light, the darkness, until there was nothing left but the void, the cold, and the unending, relentless hunger of the slum. And then, silence. Daniel opened his eyes and found himself standing in front of the building once again. The slum loomed before him, its windows dark and hollow, the symbols on its walls glowing faintly. He looked down and realized he was holding the box, its surface cold beneath his fingers, the symbols glowing faintly, as if waiting. The whispers were still there, faint but insistent, a reminder that the slum was not done with him. He knew with a chilling certainty that he would be back, that the slum had taken something from him, something he could never get back, and that it would call him again, and again, until there was nothing left of him but the whispers in the dark, the echo of a soul lost to the hunger of the slum. Chapter 3. Entering the void. Daniel stood there, staring at the building before him, his eyes drawn to the dark windows that seemed to be watching him in return. He felt an ache deep in his chest, a heaviness that spread throughout his entire body. It was as if something had been carved out of him, something he could never regain. The whispers were faint but incessant, curling around his thoughts, urging him forward once again. He knew he should turn away, leave this place and never return, but the pull was undeniable. The slum wanted him, and he was powerless against its call. He took a step forward, and then another, his feet moving of their own volition. The door loomed before him, heavy and rusted, as if it hadn't been touched in decades. But Daniel knew better. It had been waiting for him, and now that he was here, it would open once again. He reached out, his hand trembling, and touched the cold, rough surface of the door. It swung open with a groan, the darkness beyond beckoning him inside. The air was thick, the scent of decay and rot filling his nostrils as he stepped into the building. The door slammed shut behind him, the sound echoing through the narrow hallway, and Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. He was back, and the whispers greeted him, their voices filled with anticipation, with hunger. They echoed through the darkness, each one calling his name, urging him deeper into the slum. The hallway stretched before him, the walls covered in symbols that glowed faintly in the dim light. The whispers seemed to pulse with each step he took, growing louder, more insistent. The floor beneath his feet felt uneven, as if it were shifting, alive. He moved forward, his flashlight flickering, the beam barely cutting through the oppressive darkness. The walls seemed to close in, the ceiling lowering, the air growing colder with each passing moment. Daniel found himself in a room he didn't recognize, its walls lined with shelves filled with old, dusty objects, broken clocks, cracked mirrors, faded photographs. Each item seemed to hold a story, a fragment of someone's life. He reached out, his fingers brushing against a photograph. The image faded and worn. It was a picture of a family, mother, father, 2 children. They were smiling, but their eyes were hollow, empty. He shuddered, the whispers growing louder, urging him to move on. He stepped through another doorway, the room beyond shrouded in darkness. The air was cold, the whispers louder still, their voices overlapping, becoming one. The floor beneath him shifted and he stumbled, his hands reaching out to steady himself. His fingers met something cold and wet, and he looked down, his heart skipping a beat. The floor was covered in water, dark and stagnant, the scent of decay filling the air. The water rippled, as if something moved beneath its surface, and Daniel felt his breath catch in his throat. Suddenly, the whispers stopped, the silence almost deafening. The air grew colder still, the darkness pressing in from all sides, and Daniel felt a presence, a weight that seemed to press against his very soul. He turned, his flashlight flickering, and saw a figure standing in the corner of the room. It was tall, its limbs long and thin, its face obscured by a dark hood. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, but Daniel could feel its eyes on him, cold and unfeeling. The whispers began again, louder this time, their voices filled with urgency. "Come to us, Daniel," they whispered. "See the truth, see what lies beyond." The figure took a step forward, its movements slow and deliberate, its eyes locked onto Daniel's. He felt a wave of fear wash over him, his entire body trembling, but he couldn't move. The pull was too strong, the whispers too loud. He was trapped, unable to look away, unable to run. The figure moved closer, its face still hidden, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. Daniel could feel the cold emanating from it, a chill that seemed to seep into his very bones. The whispers grew louder, echoing through his mind, filling every corner of his consciousness. He could feel them, inside him, around him, guiding him, controlling him. He took a step forward, his body moving of its own accord, drawn towards the figure, the whispers urging him on. Suddenly, the figure reached out, its hand closing around Daniel's wrist, its grip cold and unyielding. The whispers rose to a deafening roar, the light from the symbols on the walls flaring to life, blinding, and Daniel felt himself being pulled forward, the darkness closing in around him. He tried to scream, but no sound came, his voice swallowed by the roar of the whispers, the light, the darkness, until there was nothing left but the void, the cold, and the unending hunger of the slum. He woke up lying on a cold, hard floor. His head pounded, his body ached, and the whispers were still there, though faint, echoing through his mind. He opened his eyes, the dim light from the symbols casting eerie shadows across the room. He was in another part of the building now. How he had gotten there, he didn't know. The room was small, the ceiling low, the walls covered in the same glowing symbols. He pushed himself to his feet, his entire body trembling, and looked around. In the center of the room was a door, its edges glowing faintly, a soft, pulsing light that seemed to call to him. He moved towards it, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps, his heart pounding in his chest. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the cold surface, and pushed it open. Beyond the door was a staircase, descending into darkness. The whispers urged him forward, their voices filled with anticipation, with hunger. Daniel hesitated, fear clawing at his insides, but he knew there was no turning back. The slum had taken him, and it wouldn't let go until it had what it wanted. He took a step forward, then another, each one more difficult than the last, the darkness growing thicker, the air colder with every passing moment. The staircase seemed to go on forever, the steps winding down into an abyss that had no end. The whispers grew louder, their voices filled with urgency, with desperation. They spoke of truths that lay hidden, of secrets buried deep within the darkness. Daniel felt his body growing weaker, the cold sapping his strength, his thoughts becoming muddled, confused. He didn't know how long he had been walking. Minutes, hours, days. Time had lost all meaning in the depths of the slum. Finally, the staircase ended, opening into a vast chamber, its walls covered in the same pulsating symbols. their light flickering, casting strange, elongated shadows across the floor. In the center of the chamber was another figure, tall and thin, its face obscured by a dark hood, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. The whispers grew louder, their voices becoming one, a deep, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate through the very core of his being. The figure turned towards him, its glowing eyes locking onto his, and Daniel felt a wave of fear wash over him, his entire body trembling. The whispers urged him forward, their voices filled with a sense of inevitability. He took a step forward, his body moving of its own accord, drawn towards the figure, the whispers growing louder, more insistent. Suddenly, the ground beneath him shifted, the floor giving way, and Daniel felt himself falling, the darkness closing in, the whispers becoming a deafening roar. He hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the breath from his lungs, and for a moment, he lay there, gasping, the cold pressing against him from all sides. He pushed himself to his feet, his entire body trembling, and looked around. He was in another room, the walls closer, the ceiling lower, the symbols glowing faintly, their light casting eerie shadows that seemed to move on their own. In the corner of the room was another door, its edges glowing faintly, a soft, pulsing light that seemed to call to him. The whispers urged him forward, their voices filled with anticipation, with hunger. Daniel moved towards the door, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps, his heart pounding in his chest. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the cold surface, and pushed it open. Beyond the door was a hallway, long and narrow, its walls covered in the same glowing symbols. The air was colder here, the darkness thicker, the whispers louder. He moved forward, his footsteps echoing off the walls, the whispers growing louder with each step. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, the walls narrowing, the ceiling lowering, until he was almost crawling, the darkness pressing in from all sides. Suddenly, the hallway opened into another vast chamber, its walls covered in the same pulsating symbols, their light casting strange, flickering shadows across the floor. In the center of the chamber was yet another figure, tall and thin, its face obscured by a dark hood, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. The whispers grew louder, their voices overlapping, becoming one, a deep, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate through the very core of his being. The figure turned towards him, its glowing eyes locking onto his, and Daniel felt a wave of fear wash over him, his entire body trembling. The whispers urged him forward, their voices filled with a sense of inevitability. He took a step forward, his body moving of its own accord, drawn towards the figure, the whispers growing louder, more insistent. And then, the figure reached out, its hand closing around Daniel's wrist, its grip cold and unyielding. The whispers rose to a deafening roar, the light from the symbols flaring to life, blinding, and Daniel felt himself being pulled forward, the darkness closing in, the world dissolving around him. He tried to scream, but no sound came, his voice swallowed by the roar of the whispers, the light, the darkness, until there was nothing left but the void, the cold, and the unending hunger of the slum. When he opened his eyes again, he found himself back at the entrance of the building, the slum looming before him, its windows dark and hollow, the symbols on its walls glowing faintly. He looked down and realized he was holding the box once again, its surface cold beneath his fingers, the symbols glowing faintly, as if waiting. The whispers were still there, faint but insistent, a reminder that the slum was not done with him. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that he would be back, that the slum had taken something from him, something he could never get back, and that it would call him again and again, until there was nothing left of him but the whispers in the dark, the echo of a soul lost to the hunger of the slum. Chapter 4. The Disappearing Light. Daniel stood at the threshold of the slum, the building's oppressive silence weighing heavily on his shoulders. The box in his hands pulsed faintly, the symbols glowing as if aware of his return. The whispers were relentless, their voices like a choir of ghosts trapped within the walls of his mind, pushing him to take the next step. He knew he could not resist. This was not just an exploration anymore. It was something far more sinister, something beyond his understanding. With a deep breath, Daniel stepped inside. The door closed behind him with a resounding slam, sealing him in the darkness. The air was heavy and cold, clinging to his skin like a second layer. He could barely see beyond his flashlight's beam, which flickered weakly, casting long, warped shadows that seemed to dance across the cracked walls. The sense of unease grew stronger, and for a moment, Daniel questioned his decision. But it was too late. He was already in the belly of the beast, and the whispers demanded he move forward. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly ahead, the walls narrowing as he progressed, the ceiling lowering until he felt as though he were walking into the jaws of some immense, unseen creature. His footsteps echoed, the sound swallowed by the dark, suffocating void. As he moved deeper, he felt the air grow colder, and the light from his flashlight struggled to pierce the dense, unnatural blackness. It was as if the darkness itself were fighting against him, refusing to be disturbed. Daniel turned a corner and stopped, his heart skipping a beat. Before him, a series of mirrors lined the walls, each cracked, the glass broken into 1,000 fragments. He shone his flashlight across them, and the reflections sent fractured beams of light scattering in every direction. In the dim, shattered images, Daniel could see himself, pale, his eyes hollow, his face twisted in fear. He looked away, trying to ignore the sense of unease clawing at his insides. Suddenly, the flashlight flickered, and then went out entirely, plunging Daniel into complete darkness. Panic gripped him, and he fumbled with the light, his hands trembling as he tried to bring it back to life. The whispers grew louder, overlapping, their voices filled with malice and hunger. He felt them pressing against his thoughts, cold and unrelenting, their words slipping through the cracks in his mind. "Daniel, come closer. See the truth." His breath quickened, his heart pounding in his ears. He reached into his backpack, desperately searching for a replacement battery, his fingers brushing against objects that seemed alien in the pitch blackness. The whispers continued, a chorus of demands that filled the emptiness around him. He felt them pulling at him, guiding his movements. And then, the flashlight sputtered back to life, the weak beam casting a narrow cone of light. Daniel let out a shaky breath, his pulse still racing. He shone the light forward, and his breath caught in his throat. The mirrors had changed. Where once they had reflected his image, now they showed something else entirely. Figures stood behind him, twisted, shadowy shapes, their faces obscured, their eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. He turned, his heart pounding, but there was nothing there, only empty space. The whispers laughed, a chilling, hollow sound that echoed through the narrow corridor. Daniel shivered, the cold pressing in from all sides, and he forced himself to move forward, his steps shaky and unsteady. The hallway led to a door, its surface old and splintered, the symbols glowing faintly in the dim light. He reached out, his hand trembling, and pushed it open. Beyond the door was a room unlike any he had seen before. The walls were covered in photographs, their edges curled and yellowed with age. He stepped closer, his flashlight revealing the faces in the pictures, families, children, men and women, all smiling, their eyes hollow and vacant. He felt a chill run down his spine as he realized that the people in the photos were the ones who had disappeared, the ones who had been taken by the slum. They had all come here, just like him, and they had never left. The whispers grew louder, their voices filled with something akin to glee, and Daniel felt his knees grow weak. He stumbled, his hands reaching out to steady himself, his fingers brushing against a photograph. The image shifted beneath his touch, the smiles twisting, the eyes narrowing, their hollow gazes locking on to him. He pulled his hand away, his heart pounding, and turned away from the walls, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. In the center of the room was an old, rotting chair, its surface covered in dark stains. A feeling of dread settled over Daniel as he approached it, the whispers urging him closer, their voices filled with anticipation. He reached out, his hand trembling, and touched the chair. The moment his fingers made contact, the whispers stopped, the silence almost deafening. Suddenly a noise echoed from the hallway behind him, a door creaking open, followed by the sound of footsteps. Daniel spun around, his flashlight shaking, the beam darting across the room. The footsteps grew louder, coming closer, deliberate, each one measured. He backed away, his heart pounding in his chest, the whispers beginning again, louder, more insistent. "Run, Daniel! You must run!" The words filled his mind, and he turned, stumbling through the door on the opposite side of the room. He ran down a narrow hallway, the walls pressing in from all sides, the air growing colder with each step. He could hear the footsteps behind him, closer now, the echoes bouncing off the walls, mingling with the whispers that filled his ears. The hallway twisted and turned, leading him deeper into the slum, the darkness growing thicker, the whispers growing louder, their voices filled with urgency. He ran, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his flashlight flickering, the beam barely cutting through the suffocating dark. He could feel the presence behind him, following him, hunting him. Suddenly, he found himself in a large, open room, the walls covered in the same glowing symbols. He stopped, his breath catching in his throat, his eyes darting around, searching for an exit. The room was empty, save for a single door on the far wall, its edges glowing faintly, a soft, pulsing light that seemed to call to him. Daniel ran towards the door, his heart pounding, the whispers urging him on. He reached it, his fingers closing around the handle, and pushed it open. The room beyond was vast, the ceiling high above, lost in shadow. In the center of the room was a pool of dark water, the surface still and mirror-like, reflecting the faint glow of the symbols on the walls. He approached the pool, his footsteps echoing, the whispers growing louder, more excited. The water was black, the surface smooth and unbroken. He knelt beside it, his flashlight illuminating the surface, and saw his reflection staring back at him, pale, hollow-eyed, his face twisted in fear. He reached out, his fingers brushing the water, and the surface rippled, the image distorting. Suddenly, something moved beneath the water, a shadow, shifting, writhing. Daniel pulled his hand back, his heart pounding, and the whispers grew louder, their voices filled with something dark and hungry. The water began to bubble, the surface breaking, and a hand emerged, thin, skeletal, its skin pale and stretched tight over bone. It reached for him, its fingers brushing against his arm, and Daniel screamed, stumbling back, his flashlight falling from his hand and clattering to the floor. The room plunged into darkness, the whispers rising to a deafening roar, the air growing colder, thicker. Daniel scrambled to his feet, his hands trembling, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He could feel the presence in the room, the thing from the water, its eyes on him, cold and unfeeling. He turned and ran, his hands outstretched, searching for the door. He found the handle, his fingers closing around it, and pulled it open, the darkness beyond swallowing him whole. The whispers followed him, their voices relentless, echoing through the narrow hallway as he stumbled forward, his feet barely finding purchase on the uneven ground. He didn't know how long he ran. Time had lost all meaning in the depths of the slum. The darkness was endless, the whispers unending, the cold pressing in from all sides. He could feel the presence behind him, always just out of sight, its eyes on him, watching, waiting. Finally, Daniel stumbled into another room, the walls covered in the same glowing symbols, their light flickering, casting long, twisted shadows. In the center of the room was another figure, tall and thin, its face obscured by a dark hood, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. The whispers grew louder, their voices overlapping, becoming one, a deep, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate through the very core of his being. The figure turned towards him, its glowing eyes locking onto his, and Daniel felt a wave of fear wash over him, his entire body trembling. The whispers urged him forward, their voices filled with a sense of inevitability. He took a step forward, his body moving of its own accord, drawn towards the figure, the whispers growing louder, more insistent. The figure reached out, its hand closing around Daniel's wrist, its grip cold and unyielding. The whispers rose to a deafening roar, the light from the symbols flaring to life, blinding, and Daniel felt himself being pulled forward, the darkness closing in, the world dissolving around him. He tried to scream, but no sound came, his voice swallowed by the roar of the whispers, the light, the darkness, until there was nothing left but the void, the cold, and the unending hunger of the slum. When he opened his eyes again, he was lying on the ground, the cold pressing against him, the whispers still there, faint but insistent, a reminder that the slum was not done with him. He looked around, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The room was empty, the symbols glowing faintly, their light casting eerie shadows across the walls. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that he would be back, that the slum had taken something from him, something he could never get back, and that it would call him again, and again, until there was nothing left of him but the whispers in the dark, the echo of a soul lost to the hunger of the slum. Chapter 5. Echoes of the Past. Daniel sat on the cold, damp floor, his back against the wall, his heart pounding in his chest. The whispers were still there, faint but ever present, like the echoes of ghosts trapped in his mind. He knew he couldn't stay here, but the exhaustion was overwhelming. The slum had taken so much from him, drained him of his strength, his will. Every breath felt like a struggle, every thought a battle against the darkness that threatened to consume him. He forced himself to stand, his legs trembling beneath him, the cold seeping through his clothes, chilling him to the bone. The room around him was small, the walls covered in the same glowing symbols, their light casting eerie shadows across the cracked floor. The air was heavy, filled with the scent of mildew and something far more metallic, a scent that spoke of blood and decay. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, and moved towards the door on the far wall. The door creaked open, the darkness beyond yawning like the mouth of some monstrous creature, ready to swallow him whole. Daniel stepped through, the whispers growing louder, guiding him, pushing him forward. The hallway stretched before him, its walls narrowing, the ceiling lowering, pressing in from all sides. He felt as though he was walking into the bowels of some immense unseen entity, the walls alive, pulsating, shifting. He came upon a staircase, its steps descending into the darkness below, each one covered in a thick layer of dust. The whispers urged him down, their voices filled with urgency, and Daniel knew he had no choice. He took the first step, then the second, his flashlight flickering as he moved deeper, the air growing colder, thicker, until it felt like he was wading through water. The darkness seemed to close in around him, suffocating, the whispers growing louder with every step he took. At the bottom of the stairs, he found himself in a vast chamber, its walls lined with shelves filled with strange ancient objects, books, jars filled with murky liquid, broken dolls, and other artifacts that seemed to come from another world. The whispers were louder here, the voices overlapping, their words filled with something akin to anticipation. Daniel moved closer, his flashlight illuminating the objects, his eyes scanning the shelves. He picked up one of the books, its cover cracked and worn, the pages yellowed and brittle. The symbols on the cover were familiar, the same as the ones on the walls, their meaning just beyond his grasp. He opened the book, the pages filled with strange, swirling script, the ink dark, almost wet, as if it had just been written. As he turned the pages, the whispers grew louder, their voices overlapping, echoing through his mind, filling every corner of his consciousness. Suddenly, a noise echoed through the chamber, a door creaking open, followed by the sound of footsteps. Daniel's breath caught in his throat, his body tensing, the book slipping from his fingers and falling to the floor with a dull thud. The footsteps grew louder, coming closer, deliberate, each one measured, echoing off the walls. He backed away, his heart pounding, the whispers urging him to run, to hide. He turned, stumbling through a narrow passageway, his flashlight flickering, the beam barely cutting through the suffocating darkness. The walls closed in around him, the air growing colder, the whispers louder, their voices filled with urgency. He could hear the footsteps behind him, following him, relentless, each one echoing through the narrow space, growing closer with every passing second. Suddenly, the passageway opened into another chamber, this one smaller, the walls covered in photographs. Daniel stopped, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps, his eyes scanning the images that lined the walls. They were old, the edges curled, the colors faded, families, children, men, and women, all smiling, their eyes hollow, vacant. He felt a chill run down his spine as he realized these were the people who had come before him, the ones who had disappeared into the slum, never to return. He moved closer, his flashlight illuminating the photographs, his fingers brushing against the images, the smiles twisted beneath his touch, the eyes narrowing, their hollow gazes locking onto him. He pulled his hand away, his heart pounding, and turned away from the walls, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The whispers were louder now, their voices filled with something dark, something hungry. In the center of the room was a table, an old rotting thing, its surface covered in dark stains. A feeling of dread settled over Daniel as he approached it, the whispers urging him closer, their voices filled with anticipation. He reached out, his hand trembling, and touched the table. The moment his fingers made contact, the whispers stopped, the silence almost deafening. Suddenly, the photographs on the walls began to move, the images shifting, the smiles twisting, the eyes widening, their hollow gazes following him, watching him. Daniel stumbled back, his flashlight shaking, the beam darting across the room. The air grew colder, the darkness pressing in from all sides, the whispers beginning again, louder, more insistent. "Run, Daniel! You must run!" The words filled his mind and he turned, stumbling through a door on the far wall, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps, his heart pounding in his chest. The hallway beyond was narrow, the walls closing in, the darkness pressing in, the air cold and stale. He ran, his flashlight flickering, the beam barely cutting through the oppressive blackness. He could hear the footsteps behind him, following him, relentless, the echoes mingling with the whispers that filled his ears. The hallway twisted and turned, leading him deeper into the slum, the darkness growing thicker, the whispers growing louder, their voices filled with urgency, with something dark and eager. He could feel the presence behind him, following him, always just out of sight, its eyes on him, watching, waiting. Suddenly, he stumbled into a large open room, the walls covered in the same glowing symbols, their light flickering, casting long, twisted shadows across the floor. He stopped, his breath catching in his throat, his eyes darting around, searching for an exit. The room was empty, save for a single door on the far wall, its edges glowing faintly, a soft, pulsing light that seemed to call to him. Daniel ran towards the door, his heart pounding, the whispers urging him on. He reached it, his fingers closing around the handle, and pushed it open. The room beyond was vast, the ceiling high above, lost in shadow. In the center of the room was a figure, tall and thin, its face obscured by a dark hood, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. The whispers grew louder, their voices overlapping, becoming one, a deep resonant hum that seemed to vibrate through the very core of his being. The figure turned towards him, its glowing eyes locking onto his, and Daniel felt a wave of fear wash over him, his entire body trembling. The whispers urged him forward, their voices filled with a sense of inevitability. He took a step forward, his body moving of its own accord, drawn towards the figure, the whispers growing louder, more insistent. Suddenly, the figure reached out, its hand closing around Daniel's wrist, its grip cold and unyielding. The whispers rose to a deafening roar, the light from the symbols flaring to life, blinding, and Daniel felt himself being pulled forward, the darkness closing in, the world dissolving around him. He tried to scream, but no sound came, his voice swallowed by the roar of the whispers, the light, the darkness, until there was nothing left but the void, the cold, and the unending hunger of the slum. When he opened his eyes again, he was lying on the ground, the cold pressing against him, the whispers still there, faint but insistent, a reminder that the slum was not done with him. He looked around, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The room was empty, the symbols glowing faintly, their light casting eerie shadows across the walls. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that he would be back, that the slum had taken something from him, something he could never get back, and that it would call him again and again, until there was nothing left of him but the whispers in the dark, the echo of a soul lost to the hunger of the slum. Daniel pushed himself up, his entire body aching, his mind filled with the haunting presence of the slum. He tried to shake it off, but the whispers seemed to cling to him, like parasites burrowing into his skin. He moved forward, stumbling through another hallway, each step an effort against the heavy weight of exhaustion and fear. The walls around him seemed to pulsate, alive with a darkness that felt sentient. The symbols carved into the plaster flickered, glowing brighter with every beat of his racing heart. He felt the slum was watching, waiting for him to make a mistake, for him to fall into its trap. It was more than a building. It was a living thing, an entity that wanted him, wanted every part of him. Suddenly, Daniel heard something, a faint sound that echoed through the hallway. It was different from the whispers, more guttural, almost like breathing. It sent a shiver down his spine, and he stopped, straining to hear. The sound grew louder, closer, a rhythmic inhaling and exhaling, like something enormous drawing in breath. He could feel the vibration of it in the floor beneath his feet, in the very walls that surrounded him. A door appeared ahead, its surface dark, breathing, alive. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the handle, the whispers in his mind urging him on, demanding that he enter. He took a deep breath, steeling himself, and pushed the door open. The room beyond was dimly lit, the air thick and cold, filled with an energy that seemed to hum through his bones. The symbols on the walls glowed brighter here, casting an eerie light that barely cut through the darkness. In the center of the room was a mirror, tall and cracked, its surface covered in a thin layer of grime. Daniel approached it slowly, his flashlight flickering, the light bouncing off the fractured glass. He saw his reflection, pale, hollow-eyed, his face twisted in fear. But there was something else there too, something just behind him, barely visible in the dim light. He turned, his heart pounding, but there was nothing there. He looked back at the mirror, and the figure was closer now, its face obscured, its body dark, twisted. The whispers grew louder, their voices filled with something dark, eager. Daniel felt a chill run down his spine, his entire body trembling. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the cold surface of the mirror, and the reflection shifted. The figure moved, its face coming into view, an empty, hollow visage, its eyes dark voids that seemed to swallow the light. Daniel stumbled back, his breath catching in his throat, and the whispers laughed, their voices echoing through the room. The mirror shattered, the glass exploding outwards, and Daniel raised his arms to shield himself. The shards cut into his skin, the pain sharp, immediate. He dropped to his knees, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps, his heart pounding in his chest. The whispers were deafening now, their voices filled with a sense of triumph, of inevitability. He pushed himself up, his entire body aching, and stumbled towards the door on the other side of the room. He had to keep moving, had to find a way out. The hallway beyond was dark, narrow, the air cold and stale. The whispers followed him, their voices a constant presence, urging him deeper into the slum. He moved forward, his feet dragging, his body heavy with exhaustion. The hallway twisted and turned, the walls closing in, the ceiling lowering, until he felt as though he was crawling through a tunnel, the darkness pressing in from all sides. He could feel the cold in his bones, the whispers in his mind, and he knew, with a certainty that came from somewhere deep within, that there was no escaping, that he was bound to this place, to the slum, and that it would never let him go. He stumbled into another chamber, the air cold, the walls covered in the same glowing symbols. In the center of the room was a figure, tall, its face obscured by a dark hood, its eyes glowing faintly. The whispers grew louder, their voices filled with excitement, anticipation. Daniel moved forward, his heart pounding, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The figure turned towards him, its eyes locking onto his, and Daniel felt a wave of fear wash over him. He knew this was it, that there was no turning back. The whispers urged him on, their voices filled with hunger, with need. The figure reached out, its hand closing around Daniel's wrist, its grip cold, unyielding. The whispers rose to a deafening roar, the light from the symbols flaring to life, blinding, and Daniel felt himself being pulled forward, the darkness closing in, the world dissolving around him. He tried to scream, but no sound came. His voice swallowed by the roar of the whispers, the light, the darkness, until there was nothing left but the void, the cold, and the unending hunger of the slum. When he opened his eyes again, he was lying on the ground, the cold pressing against him, the whispers still there, faint but insistent, a reminder that the slum was not done with him. He looked around, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The room was empty, the symbols glowing faintly, their light casting eerie shadows across the walls. Chapter 6. The Breathing Door. Daniel's eyes fluttered open, and he found himself lying on the cold, cracked floor of the slum once again. The damp chill seeped through his clothes, into his bones, and the whispers never ceased. They were quieter now, like an echo from the depths of his subconscious. But they were still there, a reminder that there was no escaping this place. He knew, with a clarity that came from resignation, that the slum wasn't done with him. It had him in its grip, and it wasn't about to let go. He pushed himself up, his limbs heavy and uncooperative, every muscle aching as if he'd run for miles. His head throbbed with pain, his vision blurred around the edges. The room was dark, the faint symbols etched into the walls casting a pale glow that barely cut through the gloom. Daniel took a deep breath, forcing himself to stand, to keep moving, even if he no longer knew where he was going. He looked around the room, the symbols seeming to writhe and pulse in the dim light, alive with some energy he couldn't understand. His gaze settled on a door that hadn't been there before. It was different from the others. The wood was warped, twisted, covered in dark organic textures. It seemed to breathe, the surface expanding and contracting in a slow, rhythmic pulse, as if the building itself were alive, inhaling and exhaling in time with the whispers that filled his head. The whispers grew louder as he approached the door, their voices overlapping, urging him forward. His heart pounded in his chest, a mixture of fear and curiosity compelling him towards the breathing door. He reached out, his fingers trembling as they brushed against the wood. It was cold, slick, like the skin of some immense, unseen creature. The door pulsed beneath his touch, the rhythmic movement almost hypnotic, and for a moment, Daniel felt a sense of calm wash over him, a strange, surreal sense of belonging. He pushed the door open, the wood groaning in protest, the darkness beyond yawning like a chasm, ready to swallow him whole. Daniel stepped through, his flashlight flickering to life as he entered. The air was thick, cold, clinging to him like a second skin. The hallway stretched ahead, the walls narrowing, the ceiling lowering, pressing in from all sides. He felt as though he was walking through the throat of some great beast, the air vibrating with the hum of the whispers, each one urging him deeper into the slum. The hallway twisted and turned, leading him downwards, deeper into the darkness. The walls seemed to shift, to pulse, the symbols glowing faintly, casting eerie, shifting shadows. He moved forward, his footsteps echoing through the narrow space, each step taking him further away from anything familiar, anything safe. The whispers spoke to him of truths, of secrets hidden within the depths of the slum, secrets that had waited for someone like him to uncover. Daniel's flashlight flickered, the beam dimming, the darkness growing thicker. He felt the air change, grow colder, and suddenly, he was standing in front of another door. This one was different, larger, more imposing. The surface of the wood was covered in deep gouges, like claw marks, and the symbols carved into it glowed with a dark, malevolent energy. The whispers rose in pitch, their voices filled with something dark, eager, urging him to open it. His hand trembled as he reached out, his fingers closing around the cold, twisted handle. The door creaked open, and Daniel stepped through, the room beyond vast, the ceiling lost in shadow. The air was different here, thicker, heavier, as though something ancient resided within these walls. The whispers echoed through the chamber, their voices filling the space, resonating through his bones. In the center of the room was a pit, a deep, dark abyss that seemed to stretch on forever. The edge of the pit was lined with the same glowing symbols, their light flickering, casting strange shadows that danced across the walls. The whispers grew louder, more excited, their voices filled with a hunger that Daniel could feel in his very soul. He moved closer to the pit, his heart pounding, his entire body trembling. He peered over the edge, the darkness below seeming to pulse, to move, as though alive. The whispers spoke of the truth that lay within the pit, of secrets that had been buried, of knowledge that could only be found by those willing to face the darkness. Daniel felt the pull, the hunger, the need to know. He knelt at the edge, the cold seeping into his bones, his eyes locked on the void below. Suddenly, the whispers stopped, the silence almost deafening. The darkness seemed to shift, to breathe, and Daniel saw something. Movement, deep within the pit. A hand, skeletal, twisted, emerged from the darkness, its fingers long and thin reaching for him. Daniel felt a jolt of fear, his breath catching in his throat, but he couldn't move, couldn't look away. The hand grasped the edge of the pit, pulling itself up, and Daniel saw a figure that had been waiting, lurking within the abyss. It was tall, impossibly thin, its limbs elongated, its face obscured by darkness. The symbols on its skin glowed faintly, pulsing in time with the whispers that had begun again, louder, more insistent. The figure climbed out of the pit, its movements slow, deliberate, each step bringing it closer to Daniel. He felt the cold emanating from it, a chill that seemed to seep into his very soul, and he knew, deep down, that this was what the slum had been waiting for. The whispers grew louder still, their voices filled with a sense of triumph, of inevitability. The figure reached out, its hand closing around Daniel's wrist, its grip cold, unyielding. Daniel felt the world around him shift, the walls closing in, the darkness growing thicker, more oppressive. The whispers rose to a deafening roar, the symbols on the walls flaring to life, their light blinding, and Daniel felt himself being pulled forward, into the abyss. He tried to scream, but no sound came, his voice swallowed by the darkness, by the unending hunger of the slum. The cold was unbearable, the void all-encompassing, and Daniel felt himself falling, the world around him dissolving, fading away. The whispers spoke to him, their voices filled with secrets, with truths that he could not comprehend, could not hold on to. And then, silence. When Daniel opened his eyes again, he found himself lying on a cold, hard floor. The air was still, the whispers gone, and for a moment he thought it was over, that he had escaped. But as he pushed himself up, his entire body aching, he knew that wasn't true. The symbols on the walls glowed faintly, their light casting long, twisted shadows across the room. And Daniel felt the pull, the hunger that had brought him here, that would keep him here, until there was nothing left of him but an echo. He looked around, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps, his heart pounding in his chest. He was in another part of the slum, a place he had never seen before, and yet it felt familiar, as if he had always been here, as if this was where he belonged. The whispers were gone, but their presence lingered, a reminder that they were always watching, always waiting. Daniel stood, his legs trembling, his body weak, and moved towards the door on the far wall. It was the only way forward, the only path left to him. He pushed it open, the darkness beyond beckoning him, calling him deeper into the slum. He stepped through, the door closing behind him with a hollow thud, the sound echoing through the narrow hallway. He moved forward, his flashlight flickering, the beam barely cutting through the thick, suffocating dark. The walls seemed to pulse, to shift, the symbols glowing faintly, their light casting eerie shadows that danced across the floor. He felt the cold pressing in from all sides, the darkness growing thicker, heavier, as though the slum itself were trying to crush him, to swallow him whole. The hallway twisted and turned, leading him deeper, the air growing colder, the whispers beginning again, faint at first, but growing louder with each step he took. He knew there was no escaping them, that they were a part of him now, a part of this place, and that they would never let him go. Suddenly, he stumbled into a large room, the ceiling high above, lost in shadow. The walls were covered in photographs, each one old, faded, the edges curled and worn. He moved closer, his flashlight illuminating the images, and he saw the faces of those who had come before, men, women, children, all smiling, their eyes hollow, vacant. He felt a chill run down his spine as he realized that their fate would soon be his own. The whispers urged him forward, their voices filled with something dark, eager, and Daniel moved to the center of the room. There, standing before him, was another door, its surface dark, covered in the same organic textures as the first, the wood breathing, pulsing in time with the whispers. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the cold surface, and the door opened, the darkness beyond yawning wide, ready to take him. Daniel stepped through, his heart pounding, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. He knew, with a certainty that came from somewhere deep within, that there was no going back, that the slum had taken him, and it would never let him go. The whispers were louder now, a chorus of voices echoing through the darkness, urging him deeper, calling him home. He moved forward, the darkness swallowing him whole, the whispers growing louder, more insistent, until there was nothing left but the void, the cold, and the unending hunger of the slum. Chapter 7. The Hollow Ones. Daniel's steps echoed softly in the vast, yawning darkness of the slum. He couldn't see where he was headed, only that there was no turning back. The whispers that had once been faint and elusive were now sharp and insistent, their voices like the hiss of snakes wrapping around his mind. He moved forward, each step heavier than the last, the cold gnawing at him, reaching for his very bones. It was as if the slum itself was alive, breathing, waiting for him to make the wrong move. He found himself in a narrow hallway, the walls closing in from both sides. The flickering light of his flashlight barely cut through the dark, and Daniel felt as if he was being squeezed by the unseen forces around him. The whispers were clearer now, overlapping, whispering things he couldn't understand. But somehow, he knew they were speaking to him, calling his name. They were welcoming him. The symbols on the walls glowed faintly, pulsing in rhythm with the whispers. He stared at them, feeling as though they were alive, staring back at him. They seemed to shift as he walked by, changing form, morphing into something familiar, yet unsettling. He turned away, his breath fogging in the cold, stale air. Suddenly, he heard a sound behind him, a scraping, dragging noise that sent a shiver down his spine. He turned around, shining his flashlight into the darkness, but there was nothing there. Only shadows danced in the weak light, shifting, undulating. The sound came again, closer this time, a scraping, like nails on a chalkboard, echoing through the narrow hallway. Daniel's heart pounded, a deep, primal fear clawing at him. He quickened his pace, his breath coming in ragged gasps, the whispers growing louder, urging him to move faster. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, the darkness pressing in on him, suffocating. The walls felt alive, pulsing, breathing, like they were reaching out for him, trying to pull him in. He stumbled into a larger room, his flashlight flickering, the beam wavering across the expanse. The room was vast, empty, the ceiling lost in shadow. The whispers quieted for a moment, replaced by a silence that was almost more terrifying. Daniel took a step forward, his eyes scanning the room, and then he saw them. Figures, standing against the far wall, their forms barely visible in the weak light. They were tall, unnaturally thin, their limbs elongated, their faces obscured by darkness. They didn't move, didn't make a sound, but Daniel could feel their eyes on him, watching him, waiting. His breath caught in his throat, his body frozen, fear rooting him to the spot. The whispers started again, louder now, echoing through the room, and Daniel felt his feet move forward, drawn towards the figures. As he approached, the figures began to move, slowly, their limbs bending at unnatural angles, their movements disjointed, almost mechanical. They stepped away from the wall, their eyes glowing faintly in the darkness, their hollow gazes locking onto Daniel's. He wanted to turn, to run, but he couldn't move. The whispers filled his mind, drowning out his thoughts, his fear, everything except the need to move forward. The figures formed a circle around him, their bodies twisting, contorting, their faces obscured by darkness. Daniel felt the cold pressing in from all sides, the air thick, heavy, the whispers now a deafening roar. The figures reached out, their fingers long, thin, skeletal, their touch like ice against his skin. He felt the world shift, the ground beneath him giving way, the darkness swallowing him whole. He fell, the air rushing past him, the whispers fading, replaced by a deep, resonant hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. He landed on something soft, the impact jarring, his vision blurring. He pushed himself up, his entire body trembling, his head pounding, the darkness around him thick, suffocating. The room he found himself in was different. It was smaller, the walls closer, covered in the same glowing symbols, their light casting long, twisted shadows. The air was colder here, the whispers distant, almost like an echo. Daniel stood, his legs shaky, his entire body aching. He moved towards the door on the far wall, the only way out, the only path left to him. The door opened into a hallway, narrow, the ceiling low, the walls pressing in on either side. He moved forward, his flashlight flickering, the beam barely cutting through the dark. He could feel the cold pressing in from all sides, the air growing thicker, the whispers beginning again, faint at first but growing louder with each step he took. Suddenly, he heard something. A voice, soft, almost a whisper, echoing through the narrow space. It was a woman's voice, pleading, desperate. "Help me!" The sound cut through the darkness, sending a chill down Daniel's spine. He turned, his flashlight scanning the hallway, but there was nothing there. The voice came again, closer now, more urgent. "Please, help me!" He followed the sound, his heart pounding, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The hallway twisted and turned, leading him deeper into the slum, the darkness growing thicker, the whispers louder. The voice called to him, leading him, guiding him through the maze of shadows and darkness. Finally, he stumbled into a small room, the air cold, the symbols on the walls glowing faintly. In the center of the room was a woman, her back to him, her body thin, frail. She was kneeling, her head bowed, her hair falling in tangled strands around her face. Daniel stepped closer, his flashlight illuminating her, and she turned, her eyes locking onto his. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow, dark, filled with something that sent a jolt of fear through Daniel. She reached out to him, her fingers trembling, her voice a whisper. "Please, help me." The words were filled with desperation, with something that tore at Daniel's heart. But there was something else there too. Something dark, something twisted. The whispers grew louder, their voices filled with anticipation, and Daniel felt his feet move forward, his body drawn to the woman, his heart pounding in his chest. She reached out, her fingers brushing against his arm, and suddenly, the world around him shifted. The walls closed in, the darkness growing thicker, the whispers rising to a deafening roar. The woman's face twisted, her eyes darkening, her mouth opening in a silent scream. Her body contorted, her limbs bending at unnatural angles, her skin darkening, cracking, as though something within her was trying to escape. Daniel stumbled back, his flashlight shaking, the beam flickering, the darkness pressing in from all sides. The woman rose, her movements disjointed, her eyes locking onto Daniel's. The whispers filled his mind, drowning out his thoughts, his fear, everything except the need to run. He turned, stumbling through the door, the darkness swallowing him whole, the whispers following him, urging him forward, calling him deeper into the slum. He ran, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his heart pounding in his chest. The hallway twisted and turned, the walls closing in, the air growing colder, thicker, the whispers growing louder. He could hear the sound of footsteps behind him, slow, deliberate, following him, never stopping. Daniel stumbled into another room, the walls covered in photographs, each one old, faded, the edges curled and worn. He moved closer, his flashlight illuminating the images, and he saw the faces of those who had come before. Men, women, children, all smiling, their eyes hollow, vacant. He felt a chill run down his spine as he realized that their fate would soon be his own. The whispers urged him forward, their voices filled with something dark, eager, and Daniel moved to the center of the room. There, standing before him, was another door, its surface dark, covered in the same organic textures as the first, the wood breathing, pulsing in time with the whispers. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the cold surface, and the door opened, the darkness beyond yawning wide, ready to take him. Chapter 8. The Faces in the Dark. Daniel moved forward, the darkness around him closing in like a living entity. The whispers had grown louder, almost deafening, and they no longer sounded like mere voices. They had form, depth, and an unmistakable malice that twisted through his thoughts. He could feel the presence of the slum now more than ever. It wasn't just a place, it was something else, something aware of him, something that thrived on his fear. The air was thick, cold, and it made breathing difficult. Daniel's flashlight flickered, barely holding on to life as he stepped further into the unknown. The narrow hallway stretched ahead, winding and twisting, like an unending maze designed to disorient and consume. The walls were closer here, the symbols pulsating faintly, their meaning just beyond his grasp. They seemed to mock him, promising answers while keeping them forever out of reach. He heard something, a soft, wet noise, like something shifting, sliding, in the darkness ahead. He stopped, his heart pounding, and held his breath, trying to listen. The sound grew louder, coming closer, and Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. His flashlight wavered, and in its trembling beam, he caught a glimpse of movement. A shadow, darting across the hallway, slipping into the dark corners of the slum. "Daniel!" The whispers called to him, insistent, their voices filled with longing. He felt their pull, the need to move towards the shadows, to see what awaited him. He swallowed hard, his throat dry, his feet dragging forward against his better judgment. It was as though the slum itself had taken hold of his body, directing his every movement. The hallway ended in a heavy wooden door, its surface covered in strange, breathing textures that seemed to pulse beneath his hand as he reached out. He hesitated, fear gripping his heart, but he knew he had no choice. He pushed the door open, the creak echoing down the narrow passage, and stepped into the room beyond. The room was larger than he expected, the ceiling high above, lost in shadow. The walls were lined with mirrors, each one cracked, broken, the glass covered in a layer of grime that made the reflections indistinct. Daniel moved closer, his flashlight sweeping across the mirrors, and he saw them, figures standing behind him, their faces obscured, their eyes dark, hollow. He spun around, his flashlight cutting through the darkness, but there was nothing there, only the empty room, silent, still. He turned back to the mirrors, and the figures were gone, the glass reflecting only his pale, frightened face. The whispers were louder now, their voices filled with laughter, a dark, mocking sound that echoed through the room, bouncing off the cracked surfaces of the mirrors. Suddenly, the light of his flashlight flickered, and then went out entirely, plunging him into complete darkness. Panic gripped him, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps, his fingers fumbling with the flashlight, trying to bring it back to life. The whispers were all around him, their voices filled with anticipation, excitement. He could feel them pressing against his mind, trying to break through, to consume him. Then, a new sound, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like fingers drumming against glass. It came from the mirrors, from all around him, the sound growing louder, more insistent, until it was a cacophony that filled the room, drowning out the whispers. Daniel felt his heart pounding in his chest, his skin crawling, the cold pressing in from all sides. A sudden flash of light. The flashlight came back to life, its weak beam barely cutting through the dark. He swept it across the room, the light reflecting off the cracked mirrors, and his heart froze. The figures were back, closer now, their faces twisted, their eyes dark, empty voids. They were no longer reflections. They were there, in the room with him, their bodies moving slowly, deliberately, their hollow eyes locked on his. The whispers were a deafening roar, urging him to run, to escape. But he couldn't move. His feet were rooted to the spot, his body frozen with fear. The figures moved closer, their limbs bending at unnatural angles, their movements disjointed, jerky. Daniel could feel the cold radiating from them, a chill that seeped into his bones, freezing him from the inside out. One of the figures reached out, its hand long, skeletal, the fingers like claws. It touched his arm, and Daniel felt a jolt of pain, a cold that burned, that tore through his flesh, his very soul. He screamed, the sound lost in the roar of the whispers, the laughter, the tapping. He pulled away, stumbling back, his flashlight falling from his hand, clattering to the floor. The light rolled, spinning, casting wild, erratic shadows across the room, and Daniel ran. He turned, his feet finally moving, his body breaking free of the terror that had held him. He ran through the door, slamming it behind him, the sound echoing through the narrow hallway as he stumbled forward, the whispers following him, calling his name, urging him deeper into the slum. He ran, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his heart pounding in his chest, the cold biting at his skin. The hallway twisted and turned, leading him through the maze of darkness, the walls narrowing, pressing in, until he felt as though he was being crushed by the weight of the slum itself. The whispers were relentless, their voices filled with anger, with hunger, and Daniel knew they wouldn't stop until they had him, until there was nothing left. He stumbled into another room, the air thick, heavy, the symbols on the walls glowing faintly, casting long, twisted shadows across the floor. In the center of the room was a pit, a deep, yawning void that seemed to stretch on forever, its edges lined with the same glowing symbols, their light flickering, pulsing in time with the whispers. Daniel moved closer, his heart pounding, his entire body trembling. The whispers were louder here, their voices filled with something dark, eager. He could feel the pull of the pit, the need to look into its depths, to see what lay below. He knelt at the edge, his eyes locked on the darkness, and he saw them. Faces, twisted, contorted, their hollow eyes staring back at him, their mouths open in silent screams. The whispers urged him forward, their voices filled with excitement, anticipation. He felt himself leaning over the edge, his body drawn towards the darkness, the faces calling to him, their eyes locking onto his. He wanted to pull away, to run, but he couldn't move. The pull was too strong, the whispers too loud, and he knew, deep down, that this was what the slum wanted, that it had been leading him here all along. Suddenly the ground beneath him shifted, the floor giving way, and Daniel fell. He plunged into the darkness, the faces rising up to meet him, their hollow eyes staring into his soul. The whispers were a deafening roar, their voices filled with triumph, with hunger, and Daniel knew, with a chilling certainty, that there was no escaping, that the slum had him, and it would never let him go. The darkness swallowed him, the cold pressing in from all sides, the whispers filling his mind, drowning out his thoughts, his fear, everything except the knowledge that he was lost, that there was no way out. He closed his eyes, the faces surrounding him, their eyes locking onto his, and he felt himself fading, his body dissolving, becoming one with the darkness, with the slum. And then silence. Daniel opened his eyes, and he was back in the hallway, the symbols glowing faintly, the air cold, thick, the whispers gone. He pushed himself up, his entire body trembling, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew with a certainty that came from somewhere deep within that this wasn't over, that the slum had taken something from him, something he could never get back, and that it would call him again, and again, until there was nothing left of him but an echo in the dark. He moved forward, his flashlight flickering, the beam barely cutting through the thick, suffocating dark. The hallway twisted and turned, leading him deeper into the slum, the whispers beginning again, faint, distant, but growing louder with each step he took. He knew there was no escaping them, that they were a part of him now, a part of this place, and that they would never let him go. He stepped into another room, the walls covered in photographs, each one old, faded, the edges curled and worn. He moved closer, his flashlight illuminating the images, and he saw the faces of those who had come before. Men, women, children, all smiling, their eyes hollow, vacant. He felt a chill run down his spine as he realized that their fate would soon be his own. The whispers were louder now, urging him forward, their voices filled with something dark, eager. Daniel moved to the center of the room, his heart pounding, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. He knew deep down that there was no way out, that the slum had him, and it would never let him go. The whispers were a chorus of voices echoing through the darkness, calling him home. He moved forward, the darkness swallowing him whole, the whispers growing louder, more insistent, until there was nothing left but the void, the cold, and the unending hunger of the slum. Chapter 9. The abyss beckons. Daniel's body ached as he moved deeper into the darkness. He could feel the weight of the slum pressing down on him, its presence wrapping around him like a shroud, pulling him into its cold embrace. The whispers were back, growing louder, their voices filled with hunger, need. They called his name, twisting through his thoughts, beckoning him towards the abyss that waited for him. The air grew colder as Daniel moved forward, his flashlight barely illuminating the narrow hallway. The beam flickered, the darkness pressing in from all sides, the symbols on the walls glowing faintly, their light pulsing in time with the whispers. He could feel them, alive, aware, mocking him, watching his every move. The hallway twisted and turned, leading him deeper, the walls closing in, the ceiling lowering, until he felt as though he was being crushed by the weight of the slum itself. He stumbled into a larger room, the air thick, stagnant, filled with the scent of mildew and decay. The walls were covered in the same glowing symbols, their light casting long, twisted shadows across the floor. In the center of the room stood an old, rotting chair, its wood darkened with age, the seat covered in stains. A feeling of dread settled over Daniel as he approached it, the whispers urging him forward, their voices filled with anticipation. He reached out, his hand trembling, and touched the chair. The moment his fingers made contact, the whispers stopped, the silence almost deafening. The room seemed to shift around him, the shadows lengthening, the darkness growing thicker. Daniel pulled his hand back, his breath catching in his throat, his entire body trembling. He turned, his flashlight flickering, the beam sweeping across the room. And then he saw them. Figures, standing in the shadows, their bodies twisted, their faces obscured. They moved towards him, their limbs bending at unnatural angles, their movements disjointed, jerky. Daniel backed away, his heart pounding, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. He could feel the cold radiating from them, a chill that seeped into his bones, freezing him from the inside out. The whispers began again, louder this time, their voices filled with something dark, eager. One of the figures reached out, its hand skeletal, the fingers long, twisted. It touched Daniel's arm, and he felt a jolt of pain, a cold that burned, that tore through his flesh, his very soul. He screamed, the sound lost in the roar of the whispers, the laughter that echoed through the room, bouncing off the walls. He pulled away, stumbling back, his flashlight falling from his hand, clattering to the floor. The light rolled, spinning, casting wild, erratic shadows across the room, and Daniel ran. He turned, his feet finally moving, his body breaking free of the terror that had held him. He ran through the door, slamming it behind him, the sound echoing through the narrow hallway as he stumbled forward, the whispers following him, calling his name, urging him deeper into the slum. He ran, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his heart pounding in his chest, the cold biting at his skin. The hallway twisted and turned, the walls closing in, pressing against him, until he felt as though he was being suffocated by the slum itself. The whispers were relentless, their voices filled with anger, with hunger, and Daniel knew they wouldn't stop until they had him, until there was nothing left. Suddenly, he stumbled into a vast chamber, its walls covered in the same glowing symbols. The air was cold, thick, filled with a strange energy that seemed to vibrate through the room, resonating through his bones. In the center of the chamber was a pit, a deep, yawning abyss that seemed to stretch on forever, its edges lined with symbols that glowed with a dark, pulsing light. The whispers grew louder, their voices filled with triumph, with anticipation. Daniel moved towards the pit, his heart pounding, his entire body trembling. He could feel the pull of the abyss, the need to look into its depths, to see what lay below. The whispers urged him forward, their voices filled with excitement, their hunger palpable. He knelt at the edge, his eyes locked on the darkness, and he saw them. Faces, twisted, contorted, their hollow eyes staring back at him, their mouths open in silent screams. The ground beneath him shifted, the floor giving way, and Daniel fell. He plunged into the darkness, the air rushing past him, the whispers rising to a deafening roar, their voices filled with triumph, with hunger. The faces rose up to meet him, their hollow eyes locking onto his, and Daniel knew with a chilling certainty that there was no escaping, that the slum had him, and it would never let him go. The darkness swallowed him, the cold pressing in from all sides, the whispers filling his mind, drowning out his thoughts, his fear, everything except the knowledge that he was lost, that there was no way out. He closed his eyes, the faces surrounding him, their eyes locking onto his, and he felt himself fading, his body dissolving, becoming one with the darkness, with the slum. The fall seemed endless, the air cold and thick, like 1,000 hands pressing against his skin. Time lost meaning. There was only the descent, the ever-deepening darkness, and the whispers. They wrapped around him, echoing through his mind, whispering secrets, promises, lies. Daniel could feel them burrowing into his thoughts, twisting them, until he no longer knew where the slum ended and he began. Suddenly, there was a jarring impact, and Daniel found himself on the cold, hard ground. He opened his eyes, his body aching, his limbs heavy, the darkness around him impenetrable. He pushed himself up, every muscle protesting, and looked around. The air was freezing, biting at his exposed skin, the whispers still there, filling the silence. He was in a vast cavern, the ceiling lost in darkness above, the floor beneath him rough, uneven. Strange symbols were carved into the stone, their faint glow barely illuminating the space around him. The whispers were louder here, more insistent, their voices overlapping, a cacophony of sound that seemed to vibrate through his very bones. Daniel took a deep breath, his heart pounding, his body trembling as he forced himself to stand. Ahead of him, in the center of the cavern, stood a structure, an altar, ancient, its surface covered in symbols that glowed faintly in the darkness. Daniel moved towards it, each step an effort, the weight of the slum pressing down on him, making every movement a struggle. The whispers urged him forward, their voices filled with something dark, something eager. He reached the altar, his fingers brushing against the cold stone, the whispers growing louder, filling his mind, drowning out everything else. He could feel the power of the slum here, the darkness that resided within its depths, the hunger that drove it. The symbols on the altar glowed brighter as his hand made contact, the light pulsing, spreading outwards, illuminating the cavern around him. And then he saw them. Figures, standing in the darkness, their bodies twisted, their faces obscured. They moved closer, their hollow eyes locked onto Daniel, their limbs bending at unnatural angles, their movements slow, deliberate. He could feel their presence, the cold radiating from them, the hunger that seemed to emanate from their very being. Daniel backed away, his heart pounding, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The whispers were deafening now, their voices filled with anticipation, with something dark and hungry. He turned, stumbling away from the altar, his feet barely finding purchase on the uneven ground. He had to get away, had to escape, but the cavern seemed endless, the darkness pressing in from all sides. The figures followed, their movements slow, relentless, their eyes never leaving him. Daniel could feel the cold creeping through his body, his limbs growing heavy, his thoughts clouded by the whispers that filled his mind. He stumbled, falling to his knees, his hands scraping against the rough stone, the pain barely registering through the fog of fear and exhaustion. He looked up, and there, in the distance, he saw a door, its edges glowing faintly, a soft pulsing light that seemed to call to him. The whispers urged him forward, their voices filled with desperation, urging him to move, to escape. Daniel pushed himself up, his entire body trembling, and began to crawl towards the door, each movement an effort, the cold biting at his skin, the darkness pressing in. The figures were closer now, their hollow eyes locked onto him, their movements growing faster, more frantic, as if they could sense that he was slipping away. Daniel reached the door, his fingers brushing against the cold surface, and he pushed it open, the darkness beyond yawning wide, ready to take him. He stumbled through the door, the whispers fading to a dull hum as the door slammed shut behind him, the sound echoing through the narrow hallway. The air was cold, stale, the darkness around him thick, impenetrable. He leaned against the door, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps, his heart pounding in his chest. He had escaped, but he knew it was only temporary, that the slum would not let him go, not truly. The hallway stretched before him, narrow, the walls closing in, the ceiling lowering, pressing in from all Chapter 10. The Reckoning. The air was thick, oppressive, almost as if the very atmosphere of slum had grown sentient, aware of the man wandering its twisted streets. Every step felt like a heavier weight on his chest, the ground beneath him sinking slightly with each movement, as though the earth itself was trying to pull him deeper into the void. The distant, muffled sounds of life, or what passed for life here, echoed faintly around him. He couldn't remember how long he had been here anymore. It felt like an eternity, yet it also felt like no time had passed at all. The once vibrant town of Slum, a place now devoid of any color or warmth, felt like a nightmare. Decay clung to every building, every street, every corner of this forsaken place. The buildings leaned in strange angles, their windows shattered or completely boarded up, as though even the structures were trying to shield themselves from the curse that hung over this place. The cracked cobblestones underfoot seemed to mock his every step, as though he was walking on the remains of something long dead. He had come here, expecting answers. He had come here, desperate to uncover the truth behind the rumors, the stories that had been whispered in hushed tones about the dark heart of Slum. And now, standing here amidst the ruins, it was painfully clear that the truth was something far more terrible than he could have imagined. Slum was not just a town, it was a prison of the mind, a place of reckoning, where the dark corners of one's soul came to life, and the mistakes, sins, and regrets of the past took shape in ways unimaginable. It was a place where you couldn't run, couldn't hide. Here, in Slum, every choice, every action, every moment of weakness came back to haunt you, and no one ever left, not unless they confronted themselves. The words of the old man echoed in his mind, as they had for the past few days, growing louder, more insistent. You cannot leave until you confront yourself. This place is a reflection of who you are. Only when you accept what you've done, what you've become, can you hope to leave. At first he had tried to ignore them, to push them aside, thinking that they were just the ramblings of a madman. But as the days stretched on, as the shadows seemed to grow longer and more oppressive, he couldn't deny the truth of it anymore. He had entered Slum full of questions, about its origins, about the people who lived here, about what exactly had caused this place to fall into ruin. But now his questions had changed. They were no longer about the town itself. They were about him, about what had brought him to this place, and more importantly, about what it would take for him to leave. The fog around him grew thicker, and he realized with a start that he was no longer alone. He had become used to the silence, to the eerie quiet that pervaded Slum. But now, he could hear the faint shuffle of footsteps behind him, the sound of something, or someone, drawing closer. He turned quickly, heart racing, but saw no one. Just the street, just the shadows that clung to the walls like sentient creatures. He tried to tell himself that it was nothing, that his mind was playing tricks on him, but deep down, he knew better. He wasn't alone. He never had been. Slum was full of eyes watching, waiting, never blinking. And though he couldn't see them, he could feel them. They were there, lurking just out of sight, ready to pounce, ready to make him face the truth. What is the truth? He thought desperately. What am I supposed to face? He began walking again, more quickly now, his footsteps echoing through the empty streets. His pulse quickened, his breath coming in shallow bursts. He had to find something, anything, that would help him understand why he was here, why this place had such a hold on him. He needed to understand what it wanted from him. As he walked, he passed by buildings that seemed to warp and twist in his peripheral vision. He could almost hear them groan, as if the town itself were alive, suffocating under the weight of the memories it held. The sound of distant voices rose up from nowhere, whispers that scraped against his mind, urging him to turn back, to give up, to accept his fate. But he couldn't. Not yet. The path ahead opened up into a small square, surrounded by more crumbling buildings. The square was eerily quiet, save for the faint whisper of wind rustling through broken windows. In the center of the square stood a large, ornate mirror, its frame gilded but covered in grime, its surface cracked and distorted. The reflection that stared back at him was not his own. It was a twisted, warped version of himself, his features stretched and bent in unnatural ways. His eyes, once full of life, were now dark and hollow, like the eyes of someone long dead. He stepped closer, feeling an irresistible pull toward the mirror. He reached out, his hand trembling as he touched the cold surface. The moment his fingers made contact, a jolt of electricity shot through him, causing him to pull back in shock. The world around him seemed to shudder, as if the mirror had disrupted the very fabric of reality. The air grew thick, the shadows lengthening, distorting. And then, just as suddenly, the space before him changed. The mirror was no longer a reflection of Slum. Instead, it showed him something else. A memory, a past he had buried deep within himself. He saw himself younger, standing in a room with a woman. The image was distant, blurry, but he could make out enough to recognize the woman's face. It was someone he had loved, someone he had promised he would never leave. But the scene quickly shifted, and he saw himself walking away, leaving her behind without so much as a glance back. The pain in her eyes was unmistakable, and in that instant, he realized just how much he had hurt her. He turned away from the mirror, his stomach churning with guilt. But the vision didn't stop. It followed him, changing with each step, revealing more and more of his past sins, the people he had abandoned, the promises he had broken, the lies he had told. All of them played out before him like a film he couldn't stop watching. And then, as if to punish him for every wrong, the whispers began again. This time, they weren't just voices. They were faces, screaming in agony, accusing him, calling him out for every choice he had made. The sound grew louder, overwhelming him. It was as if the whole world of Slum had come alive to confront him, to remind him that he could not escape what he had done. "You cannot outrun your sins," a voice said, soft but firm, cutting through the chaos. It was the old man's voice, but it was different now. There was no warmth in it, no comfort. It was cold, like the truth itself. He fell to his knees, his hands shaking, his mind racing. What was he supposed to do? How could he face this? How could he atone for the things he had done? The mistakes he had made seemed so overwhelming, so impossible to undo, and yet somewhere deep within, he knew the answer. To leave Slum, to free himself from the torment, he had to face the truth, his truth. He had to accept the things he had done, accept that he could never change the past, and somehow find a way to move forward. With a final, shaky breath, he looked up at the mirror one last time. The reflection staring back at him was no longer twisted, no longer monstrous. It was just him. Just the man he had been, the man he was now, and for the first time, he didn't look away.